Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today I'm gonna be doing my May wrap-up. I can't believe that the month of May has already come to an end. Like, this month just freaking flew by. I also, oh my gosh, did you see it? Did you see it? The Summerween merch is in! Isn't it so stunning in person? Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed. I can't believe that Summerween is also just around the corner. Like, the closer that we get to July, the closer that we get to Summerween, and that makes my heart happy. Before we do jump into today's wrap-up, I just wanted to say thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. You may be familiar with Skillshare because of some of their creative classes like photography and illustration and design and different things like that, but what you might not know is that Skillshare has so many different kind of career focused classes as well. I think now more than ever we are starting to realize that traditional jobs are not a one size fits all, and now we're at a place in time where you can learn how to design a career that fits you best. I think Skillshare is the perfect place to be if you're wanting to explore those creative or those career focused options. You can learn how to be your own boss, and you can learn a lot of freelance tips from people who are actually doing these things on their own. I know that thinking about the future can be super intimidating, but I also think that no goal is too small. And I think that the teachers on Skillshare, you know, they really break it down and take you step by step, so it really feels like baby steps and not just like you're getting thrown into something that you don't understand. I recently just started taking this class called Start Your Creative Career, Build a Sharp, Smart Online Presence, and this one is taught by an entrepreneur, and I feel like because I'm someone online who has a creative career, it's really interesting for me to take these classes and learn from other people who are doing this. I love her advice about, you know, understanding your analytics better and thinking of yourself as more of a business. Those things are super important, and they're not something that's just like widely taught. So I appreciate the different kind of, you know, creative online training that she gives during this class, and I think it's very useful. But of course, if that class does not intrigue you, they do have so many other classes in creative and career focused topics. There really is something for everyone on Skillshare. So the first 1,000 people to click the link down in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare's membership so that you can explore your creativity and check out all that they have to offer. And thank you so much once again to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get into the wrap-up, shall we? So in the month of May, I read a total of 15 books, which ended up being 3 mangas and then 12 novels. I did have 2 DNFs this month. The first book that I DNF'd was this book called Pinata, which is a book that I was trying to read for a video that I was doing of reading, you know, thriller and horror books by Latin or Hispanic authors, and this one just really didn't work for me. I think it was the characters were just driving me absolutely crazy in this book. I think I got about 45% of the way through the audiobook before I decided to DNF this one. And then I also very recently, I just DNF'd Jasmine and Jake Rock the Boat. This is another one that I got about 30-ish% of the way through the audiobook on Libby, and I don't know why. I don't know if I just wasn't in the mood for something like this at the time that I was reading it, but this protagonist and then kind of like her whole family, like they were just driving me absolutely crazy reading this book. So this very well just might be a me problem, and maybe I just wasn't in the mood to be reading this when I was starting it. And so I don't know if this one will be a forever DNF from me, but for now it's a DNF. But I did work on a few different exciting reading vlogs in the month of May. I kind of started off the month of May with a reading vlog where I read Emily Henry's latest romance book called Happy Place. I did an entire reading vlog dedicated to this book, which ended up being so much fun. I also did another like reading 3 new thriller and horror books kind of vlog like around mid-May. And then towards the end of the month, I did the video of reading horror books from Latin and Hispanic authors, which was so much fun and honestly one of my like favorite videos that I think that I've ever made on my channel. Like, it was just such a good time. And then the last reading vlog I worked on this month was reading books that I think will be 5 stars, which was also a really fun kind of reading experiment type of video. So I will have all of the vlogs linked down below if you missed any of them that I was working on this month. I also made a Patreon exclusive video this month with my dad. It was kind of like a companion video for the reading books by Latin authors video, because in this video my dad taught us how to make one of his favorite Mexican dishes, and then we also did a little bit of a Q&A at the end of the video with questions that my Patreon submitted for us to answer, and it was so much fun and it was so cute, and it was just so fun to like get my dad on camera and like, you know, hang out. And it was one of my favorite videos that I've made for my Patreon, so if you missed that, I'll have that link down below as well. Alright, so with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the wrap up. I will start with the 3 mangas that I read this month. The first manga that I picked up was actually Orange Volume 7, and this is one that I didn't even realize that this came out earlier this year, because, you know, Orange is one of my actual favorite mangas of all time. I think if I had to pick like one manga series that's like my favorite of all time, I think I would say Orange. And so I'm kind of bummed to let you know that I ended up giving this volume in particular only about 3 stars. I feel very similarly with this volume how I felt about volume 6, which was like the Orange volume Future. I feel like these 2 additions to the series are just not necessary because the entire Orange series is about 5 volumes long, and then these other 2 are like, they're supposed to take place in the future, like after the events of the series is over, and I just don't think that they are necessary, to be honest, because I just don't think they hit as hard as I want them to, and so this was a 3-star for me. It was fine, but if you're a fan of Orange and like you love the first 5 volumes, I really don't think it's necessary to read volume 6 or 7. Like, there's just no point. And then I was finally able to read Spy Family volume 9, and this is the latest volume of Spy Family. I'm completely caught up on the series now. Like, how exciting. And I've got to say, this one for me was a 5-star. I love this one. I think volume 9 is one of my favorites in the series now because it was just so freaking cute. The moments that this family gets into in this particular volume, it was just so entertaining, and I especially love their dog Bond. Bond is just like one of my favorite characters to read in this series. Like, he's genuinely such a big, fluffy, adorable little bean. Look at this cutie. Oh my gosh. I mean, this dog is cute too, but look at Bond. He's like a big, cuddly, snuggly polar bear. I just adore it so much, and all of the things that were happening in this volume, it just had me like laughing and like smiling. It was so cute. It was a good time. I adore Spy Family. And then the last manga that I read this month was a very unique one. It was this book called Downfall, and this is just, it's not a series or anything, it's just the one book. But this is from the same author as Goodnight Pun Pun, which was actually a manga that I tried to read, and I actually DNF'd that one when I tried to read it, and so I was a little bit nervous picking this one up. And this has to be one of the most depressing mangas that I've ever read in my life. We're basically just following this guy who is a manga artist. Like, he is a guy who creates manga, but he actually like hates manga so much, and he's just really struggling with his life. Like, he's kind of going through a divorce potentially with his wife, and he's kind of like being unfaithful to her and sleeping around, and it's just this look at how, you know, like, you can be super successful in something that you do, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be happy. This book was a really tough read. There was especially some scenes towards the end that I found really awful to read, and there's a trigger warning for certain things that I'm like, ooh, like, I put it in my Goodreads review if you're curious for what the trigger warning is. I'm torn about how to speak about this book because I ended up giving it 4 stars. It was something that I really enjoyed in a way, but it was really hard to read because it was really sad. It had this very like sad, gloomy feel to this entire thing, but I also kind of appreciate the message of like, it doesn't matter how much fame and success that you have, like, that doesn't mean that you're going to be happy, and that doesn't equal a good life. And I definitely related to some of the struggles that this protagonist had, even though I thought he was really like frustrating and he was very condescending a lot of the times, and you know, he was not an easy protagonist to follow, but I did relate to some of the things that he was going through with his talk about how like it's so hard to work in an industry like this where you just have to keep one-upping yourself all the time, and there's so much pressure on you to like do the next big thing. You know, like, I just really related to some of the things that he was going through, but at other times I found him so frustrating to read. So I have very mixed feelings about this book, but it was a really interesting reading experience. So that's all I'm going to say about it. All right, and then on to the 12 novels that I read this month. The first thing I picked up was Lone Women by Victor LaValle, and this one is a horror book that has a very historical fiction fantasy vibe to it because it takes place in the year 1915, and we're just following this woman who is carrying around this giant trunk wherever she goes, and you're kind of like, what's going on with this trunk? What is she up to? And it's about her traveling through the American West. It's just a very unique time period to read about, and this book, I wanted to love it more than I did. I feel like this book, the tone for me was all over the place because at times I was so invested in like the horror aspects of this book, but then I feel like this book does get a little bit more fantasy than I was anticipating that it would, and like some of the historical setting for me just like really bored me to tears because, you know, I have such a love-hate with historical fiction. I feel like sometimes they really work for me and then sometimes they just completely bore me, and unfortunately this was more of the case where it was just really hard for me to get through because the historical aspects just felt so historical. I know that's not a valid complaint, and that's why, you know, I'm still giving this book 3 stars. It was fine, and I just recognize that this is not for me, but I do think this is a book that could work really well for a lot of other people if you're really into historical fiction, kind of horror fantasy stuff. And then the next book that I read this month was For You and Only You by Caroline Kepnes, which this is another book that like, this one had so much potential. And this is, if you didn't know, this is the 4th book in the Joe Goldberg series, you know, like the You series. It's on Netflix. It's a really popular show. I'm sure you've heard of it. And I was so excited when I started this book, you know, because Joe Goldberg is like one of my favorite fictional characters to follow just because he's so unhinged and I just love getting like his dialogue in his head. Like he's just really entertaining to read about, you know? And in the beginning of this book, I was like, holy shit, could this be a 5-star? Like it was going so well at the beginning and I was really enjoying it. But then I feel like this book just falls into the issue that I have with almost every book in this series, is that it just starts to get really repetitive, and it feels like Joe Goldberg never really seems to learn from his past mistakes. Like he's just doing the same shit over and over and over again. And this book is like 430-ish pages long. Like I just don't think there's any reason for a thriller like this to be that long, especially when it is so repetitive and it's just the same shit over and over again. It just sucks because I feel like this author, like she has such great ideas and it always starts off really strong and I get really invested and into it. And so I ended up giving this one 3 stars, and to be honest, I think I'm just kind of done with the Joe Goldberg series. Like I don't think I want to read anymore. And then for that same reading vlog, I ended up reading The Last Word by Taylor Adams, which this is actually my BookTube pick for the month of May. How exciting. And this is one that I was really excited to read because, you know, it's Taylor Adams. He's the author of No Exit, which is one of my favorite thriller books that I've ever read. And this one just sounded so interesting because in this story, our protagonist, we're following this woman who writes a 1-star book review for this guy who's an author, and it's like the first review that goes up for his book, and he gets super like butthurt and annoying about it, and he messages her and he's like, hey, I need you to take down this review. And she's like, no, what the heck? And so they kind of get into this little online, you know, like back and forth of like, no, I'm not taking down my review. And then he's like, you need to do this. And it's kind of like weird. And then the story really takes place when she's like house sitting for this woman, and she's kind of like in the middle of nowhere in Washington. It's like on a beach, and she starts to get the weird feeling that like someone's watching her, that's like someone's trying to get into the house. Ugh. Oh my gosh, this book just had the best atmosphere. Like the atmosphere in this was so spooky. It was so creepy. I just absolutely fell in love with the atmosphere in this book. I also just really related a lot to this main character actually, and a lot of her talk about like her anxiety and like different things that she was going through. And I had so much fun with this book. I just had such a great time. I feel like this is the perfect example of like how I want the pacing to be in my thrillers. Like this shit was non-stop fun, action, intense things happening. Like there was not a dull moment in this book, you know, and I really appreciate that. I do feel like the ending for me got a little bit, you know, like a little tad chaotic and cliche with like, there was just so many twists happening that some of it felt a little bit ridiculous or kind of like unrealistic, but I still ended up giving this one 4 stars. I still really enjoyed it. By the time this video goes up, there will be a live show link down below that you can check out with me and Riley discussing this book live. And then the next book that I ended up reading this month was Happy Place by Emily Henry, which again, this is probably one of the most popular romance books of the year because Emily Henry has really become that bitch. And I don't want to talk about this too much because I did do an entire reading vlog dedicated to this book this month, so if you missed that, I'll have that link down below. But Happy Place was such a cute and like lovely surprise because in this story, we're following this group of friends and they have this little cabin that they go to out in Maine every single year. And one of the friends is like letting them know that their family's going to be selling this cabin, and so this is going to be their last time, the last summer at this cabin. And what their friends don't know is that our protagonists, Harriet and Wynne, they have recently broken up and they've been together for like years, and like this is like a huge thing for their little friend group, you know? And so they don't want to like ruin the vibes of like their last summer at this cabin, so they decide to not tell any of their friends that they've split up, and they have to like pretend to still be together. So it's like a cool little modern twist on like the fake dating, because like yeah, they've been engaged for like 8 years or something like that, but now they've been broken up for about 6 months and they're gonna have to pretend like they're still together because they don't want to like disappoint any of their friends or like take away from like their last summer there. So it's kind of fake dating-ish, and it's also kind of like second chance-ish because they've been together. I really loved both of these characters and I just connected to them so much, and I also just really adored the friend group in this book. There was a few moments towards the end of this book that almost made me like a little misty-eyed. Like it was just so beautiful. And like yes, even though this book does suffer from a lot of miscommunication, which is one of my least favorite tropes, I don't know why it just didn't bother me as much with this one because I was so invested in the characters, and I just really, I don't know, I really love the way that Emily Henry writes. Like there's just something about her writing that I just really connect with, and so I ended up giving this one 5 stars. It was a 5-star from me. I just really enjoyed myself while I was reading this. And then the next book that I read was Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, and this one was such an amazing surprise because if you didn't end up seeing my vlog that I did for this book when I read books by Latin authors, because this one was probably my favorite thing that I read for that video. Like, this was just so freaking interesting. And so this one, it's kind of like this massive, you know, it's almost like, what is it, almost 600 pages. It's this massive kind of like horror, fantasy, kind of magical type of book. So I was not really sure if this was going to be my thing or not. And what's really cool about this book is that it's broken up into like, I think 5 or 6 different parts. But the thing that's crazy is that there's no chapters in between. Like, you just get the 6 parts of the book and there's no like chapter breaks or anything like that. It's just 6 long chunks. And I thought that that would be something that I would hate, but to be honest, I actually think it works really well for this story. And I almost think, you know, these 6 different parts of the story almost read like their own individual like short stories in a way, because they all feel so different, but then they all connect in like a really great way. And in this story, we're following this character named Juan, and then he has this son named Gaspar. And the thing with Juan in this book is that he has some of these like magical abilities. Like, they're never fully explained, but they're just kind of there and they're really interesting. Like, he has the ability to like summon demons and like communicate with another world essentially, and he can like speak sometimes without even moving his mouth, you know, like he just has these really cool and unique magical abilities. And he's worried though, because he thinks that his son is starting to show signs that like he's also going to be able to have these magical abilities, and that scares him because he doesn't want his son's life to be in danger because he has these things. And it's really interesting because right at the start of this book, Juan's wife and Gaspar's mother, she passes away, and so they're on this road trip throughout this book to try to learn the truth about what really happened. I don't know, it doesn't sound that interesting when I pitch it to you, and I realize that when I'm saying it out loud, but this book was just everything. I don't know, there was just something about it. It was so magical. The atmosphere in this book has some of the best atmosphere that I've read in a book in such a long time. Like, it just really made me feel some type of way. I don't know why. The only like reading experience I could compare this to is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, and I don't know why, but in my head it makes sense. I'm like, they have the same vibes to them. And I feel like it's just because you're following these characters through like the span of basically like their whole lives, and like just the magical, like just the touch of like magical elements. It just felt very like Addie LaRue to me, and I just loved it. I ate the shit up. I think I'm giving it 5 stars because initially, like after I finished reading it, I was like, oh, like 4 or 4.5 stars. But like, I've been thinking about this book nonstop for the entire month of May, and like it's gotta be a 5 star. It was so freaking good, so unique. I've never read anything like this. And then the next book that I read for that same vlog of reading books by Latin authors was The Haunting of Alejandra, and this is by V. Castro. And this one is about this woman. She's going through a really hard time because she is very severely depressed to the point where she's pretty suicidal, and she has this husband who just doesn't give a fuck. Like, her husband is just one of those guys who just like kind of expects her to stay at home all day and raise the children and just like do it all with a smile on her face, and he doesn't really understand why she would be unhappy with like the perfect life that they have. And it's really hard on her, you know, because she has these 3 kids. She doesn't really know if she ever really wanted to be a mother, and so she's struggling with those feelings as well. And it's also about how she feels like she's being haunted by this Mexican folk demon that's called La Llorona. And it's really interesting because that Mexican folk demon also has this story of like, it's like this legend about this woman who she drowned her own kids and then she killed herself afterwards. This book was just really gorgeously written. This was a very stunning book. This is more on the side of like literary horror. The horror elements are definitely there, but they're not as like the horror elements, in my opinion, they don't really come in as strong until like closer to the end of this book. But I still think the writing in this book was just absolutely stunning. I will warn you though, if you have any trigger warnings for things like depression, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, anything like that, I feel like this one might be pretty hard to read. But I was also just so impressed by the writing in this book, and I ended up giving this one 4 stars because I loved the first half of this book a lot more than the second half. I feel like in the second half there was some things that just started to lose me, and I felt like it could wrap up a little bit quicker, but I'm still so impressed by the writing in this book and like how connected I felt to these characters and the story. I thought it was so well done. And then I also ended up reading 19 Claws and a Blackbird, and this is by the same author as Tender as the Flesh, which is why I was so excited to read this short story collection. This one actually, it's a collection of 20 short stories. Horror is usually like my favorite genre when it comes to, you know, short story collections, because I think that horror can work so well in the short story format. But unfortunately, this one just did not work for me at all. Like there were very few, if any, stories that I really enjoyed or was even affected by at all. I think the ones that have stuck with me the most since reading it was that second short story called Roberto. That one was just, oh my god, it was so disturbing, and it's really just stuck in my brain. And then there was this one called The Dead, and like those were the only 2 out of the 20 that I can even really like recall right now off the top of my head because I remember them. But the rest of these were so forgettable. I feel like there was a lot of them that also felt very similar. Like when I was reading one of the ones later on, I was like, didn't I already read something just like this like earlier in the collection? And I don't know, I'm just so bummed because I feel like there was a few of these too that had some really great potential to be something interesting, but they almost just kind of felt like unfinished ideas that were just kind of like not fully thought out, and like I don't know what this was, which is such a bummer. Like I ended up giving this one 2 stars. It was probably my least favorite thing that I read for this whole month, which freaking sucks because I had such high hopes for this. And then the next book that I read this month is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and like oh my god, I finally got around to reading this. This book has been on my TBR for like probably like 4 years now, ever since it published. And this is a really beautiful, just absolutely gorgeous literary fiction kind of story where we're following this boy. His nickname is Little Dog, and this whole story is really interesting because it's basically just like a letter to his mother. Inside of this flap here just says that this is a brutally honest exploration of race, class, and masculinity, and I could not agree more with that. I feel like this story also does a really great job about talking about what it's like to be an immigrant living in America during these times, you know, because our protagonist that we're following in this story, he's Asian and queer, and a lot of the story is him talking about his specific struggles growing up in America, and also just like under the eye of his mom, who wasn't always approving of certain things that he would do. And this was just so freaking powerful. Like I think this is one of my favorite books that I've ever read in my whole life, and definitely like one of the best books that I've read this year, because some of these quotes were just absolutely haunting and like so beautiful. This is one of the most beautifully written books that I've ever read. And if you are curious to hear some of the quotes, because like I did tab so many things and I was just like absolutely floored by the writing in this book. So if you want to hear more of the specific quotes from this book that really made this book a 5-star read for me, then I would highly recommend checking out the vlog that I uploaded. This was included in the vlog of reading books that I think would be 5 stars, and this was definitely a 5-star read. And in that vlog I do go through and kind of like read out a lot of quotes aloud that really impressed me, so I would highly recommend checking out that vlog. I'll have it linked down below. But like holy shit, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, yeah, y'all were not kidding. This is amazing. I also finally ended up reading Beasts of Extraordinary Circumstance by Ruth Emmy Lang, and this is one that I actually read kind of because of my Patreon. I pulled out of the Patreon prompt jar this month to read a book that's been on your TBR for the longest amount of time, and this one has been on my TBR since October 2017, so I figured it was about time that I read this book, you know? And this story is really unique because we're following this young boy, and his name is Waylon Gray, and he was like raised by wolves. He's an orphan, and he has some kind of like magical abilities that people don't really understand, and I don't even think as the reader we fully understand either, but it's something like maybe he can control the weather, like he can kind of talk to animals, like he just has some kind of magical things going on with this boy. And this story is really interesting because it's broken up into different parts, and in each part of the book it takes place during a different year of this boy's life, but we never get his perspective. It's like told from the point of view of different people who are in his life, which I think was a really interesting choice because I think it makes Waylon's character even more mysterious to like never really get his point of view, but the story really is about him. And I'm so glad that I read this book because I thought it was just so beautiful. It was so unique. I don't know if I've ever read a story quite like this. I just really was fascinated by Waylon's character, and I thought he was a really cool character to follow in this story. I do think for me the first half of this book was stronger than the last half of this book. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think it was the last 2 books, because towards the end time starts flying really quickly. So after the 4th interlude part of the story, I really loved the ending. Like the ending of this book was absolutely stunning, top tier in every single way. But there was a good chunk of this book somewhere around the middle where I just really felt like things were slowing down and the pacing of it was kind of starting to drive me nuts. I felt like it just needed to wrap up a little bit quicker, but then that ending came in with like an absolutely stunning ending, and it made me really love it all over again. So I ended up giving this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed myself while reading this, and I'm glad that I checked this one out because, you know, this one does feel a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but it was a really really beautiful story, and I'm really glad that I read it. And then the next book that I read for that same video was Greek Lessons, and this is from the same author as The Vegetarian, which I have not yet read The Vegetarian, but I know that I need to. And this one, the inside here, it just says a powerful novel about the saving grace of language and human connection. And I really think that's the perfect way to describe this, because this is one of those like really beautifully written kind of like literary fiction books where we're following this protagonist who is in this classroom. She's taking these Greek lessons, but it's also about how she's mute and she's no longer speaking. And then the teacher of this class, he is slowly going blind, and he's also kind of dealing with a lot of things going on in his life. And we just kind of follow these two characters as they're both kind of struggling in a lot of different aspects in their lives. And this book is just so well written, and it's so interesting to see how language really connects us as people, and how much we rely on our 5 different senses, you know, because we're following a character who is no longer speaking, and then the other character is slowly losing their eyesight. I feel like this book does a really great job at showing like what those senses can do for us as people and how it helps us connect with people. But then even more so how when you start to lose access to those things, how you rely on your other senses even more. God, just some of the writing in this book, like this is another one that just had so many quotes that were absolutely stunning and just stopped and like made me think about them for such a long time. And again, that same reading vlog that I just mentioned, I'll have it linked down below, where I actually do read out a lot of the quotes from this, because this has so many powerful quotes in it. And this was another one that I ended up giving 4 stars. And then for that same reading vlog, I did end up picking up a romance book because I read Something Wild and Wonderful by Anita Kelly. And this one is a male-male romance that I've been really excited to read, because this one, okay, it takes place on the Pacific Crest Trail, which is so freaking cool because the Pacific Crest Trail is this really well-known long hiking trail that basically goes on the entire Pacific coast. So the trail starts in like California and it goes all the way through Oregon and Washington. And one of my favorite books of all time, Wild, is like a nonfiction book about this woman who hiked the Pacific Crest Trail. And so after Wild, I got really obsessed with the idea of this Pacific Crest Trail, and I was just like wanting to read more things about it. And so this is a cute romance that literally takes place when these two guys, they meet on the Pacific Crest Trail when they're both hiking it, and then it's kind of a story about their love and their romance. And I just absolutely fucking loved this so much more than I thought that I would. I wasn't even originally planning on including it in that reading vlog that I was working on, but after I started it, I was so obsessed with it that I was like, oh my god, turn on the camera, like this is gonna be a 5-star, I need to include it in this vlog kind of thing. And both of these characters, okay, so we have this guy named Alexei, and he has recently been completely disowned by his family for being gay, which is just awful, like the worst. And then we're following this other guy named Ben, and he is kind of like hiking with a group of people kind of, but then he slowly just makes his way to hang out with Alexei. Ben is a lot more comfortable with his sexuality than Alexei is, because Alexei's, you know, obviously insecure for a lot of valid reasons, because his whole family has been treating him like shit, and like a lot of people in his life are treating him like shit and they don't really understand him, and so naturally he's pretty insecure about these things. Their freaking connection in this book was so freaking cute. I love the way that Ben calls him Lex, and like, oh, there was just so many moments I was like squealing because they were so freaking cute. And this is definitely like one of my favorite romance books that I've read for this whole year. This one was a 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. It wasn't the perfect 5 stars because I was like a picky ass bitch and I was like nitpicking things at the end, but otherwise this was top tier. This was so freaking good. It's a book that I really know that I'm gonna want to reread again in the future, which I know says right there how iconic it is. And then the last book that I read this month was How High We Go in the Dark, which this is another book that I read because of my Patreon prompt jar. The prompt that I pulled was to read a book that was published on your birthday, which, like, how cool is that? I didn't even realize that this book came out last year on my birthday, and so I was finally able to get to this one. I've been wanting to read this book for literally so long because I've been hearing such great things. This one is a kind of like sci-fi post-apocalyptic type of story where we follow these characters who are living in this world where there was this Arctic plague, and it takes place around the year like 2030 is when this Arctic plague breaks out. But then we follow a number of different characters like years and years and years after this plague has happened. This book feels very similar to like Station 11. Like if I had to compare it to anything, it would be very similar to that because it's a book that's like about a pandemic, but it's not really like about the pandemic, you know? It's more about like the human connections and like the human relationships and how these humans are recovering from living in a world that had this pandemic. And this story was really interesting. It was really unique because each one of the like chapters chapters or like sections of the book would follow like a bunch of different characters, and because of the way that it was told, I found myself really invested and interested in some sections more than others. But overall, this one ended up being 4 stars for me as well. This was a really enjoyable reading experience, and honestly, like this whole vlog that I did at the end of the month was one of the most successful reading vlogs I think that I've ever had, because every book in that vlog was 4 stars or higher. Like, yes, not everything was a 5-star, but at least I know what I'm gonna like. You know, like I still have a good eye for knowing what I'm gonna like. But yeah, those are all of the books that I read in the month of May. How exciting that, you know I didn't read a ton of books this month, or at least like not as much as I usually do, with only 12 novels and the 3 manga, but out of those 12 novels, I read mostly things that I really enjoyed. Like the lowest rating that I had this month was a 2-star, and that was only 1 2-star. I had a couple 3 stars, but most everything across the board was 4 or 5 stars. Like how great is that for me? I love that. You'll have to let me know, how did the month of May go for you reading wise? How many books did you read in the month of May? What was your favorite book that you read this month? I would also love to know if you've read any of these books that I mentioned. What are your thoughts on them? Let me know down below. And also, the Summerween merch is out in the world. It's out there. If you would like to still order Summerween merch, you still can. I will have the Summerween link down below if you want to go and check it out. I feel like these shirts just turned out so freaking cute and crispy. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with a new video. Bye.